"You don't belong in my courtroom," the judge sneers, dismissing the black lawyer before him. But when the lawyer stands his ground and speaks his name, the judge's smirk vanishes. His hands tremble. The man he just disrespected. He was once his brightest student. The courtroom holds its breath as the truth unravels. Justice is about to be served in more ways than one. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked open, revealing a scene both familiar and foreign to David Carter. The towering shelves of legal books, the polished mahogany judge's bench, the cold, indifferent stares from men in pressed suits. It was all too familiar. And yet something about this moment felt profoundly different. David adjusted the cuffs of his navy blue suit, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric. It had been years, decades, since he first stepped into a courtroom. Back then, he was just a wide-eyed kid with second-hand textbooks and a fire in his soul. Now, he was a defense attorney with a reputation for fighting battles no one else dared to. But none of that seemed to matter now, because as soon as he stepped forward, the judge barely glanced up before uttering the words that sent a cold chill down David's spine. "You don't belong in my courtroom." The words were slow, deliberate. Poison, wrapped in civility. Judge Richard Holloway's voice carried the weight of disdain, each syllable soaked in condescension. David's jaw tightened. He wasn't new to prejudice. It lurked in hushed whispers, in skeptical glances from colleagues, in the double takes whenever he walked into the wrong kind of courtroom. But this was blatant, unchecked. He took a measured breath, steadying himself. "Excuse me, Your Honor?" Judge Holloway leaned back, finally lifting his gaze. His icy blue eyes settled on David with something between amusement and irritation. "I don't recall inviting you to speak." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The stenographer stole a glance at David before quickly lowering her gaze to her notepad. A junior attorney sitting at the prosecution's table looked almost embarrassed. Almost. David swallowed the rising anger in his throat. He had worked too hard for this moment. He wasn't going to let some bitter old judge unravel everything he had built. With practiced ease, he straightened his shoulders and spoke with measured confidence. "I'm here representing my client, Marcus Hayes, in the matter of—" "I know who you are," the judge interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And I know your kind." The words hung there, heavy, suffocating. David's stomach clenched. He forced himself to stay still, to maintain control. Every fiber of his being told him to react, to demand respect, to push back against the venom in the judge's tone. But he knew how this game was played. Then, something happened. The judge's face shifted, just for a moment. A flicker of something that didn't quite fit the cruelty in his words. It was recognition. David saw it, the slight widening of the eyes, the way the judge's fingers tensed around his gavel. "He knows me." Realization struck David like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just some bigoted old judge treating a black lawyer like he didn't belong. This was something personal. David spoke again, his voice now sharper. "I'd like to proceed with the case, Your Honor, unless there's a legal reason preventing me from representing my client." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers twitched. For the first time, he looked unsettled. And then, almost imperceptibly, his hands trembled. David's pulse quickened. This reaction, this hesitation, wasn't just disdain. It was fear. The realization struck hard and fast. He knows exactly who I am, but from where? And then, in a rush, the past came crashing back. A dusty classroom, the scent of chalk and old paper. A young law professor, pacing in front of eager students. David's breath caught in his throat. Richard Holloway. Not just a judge, not just another bigot in a robe. His former professor, his mentor. For a moment the courtroom felt like it had frozen in time. David Carter stood still, his heartbeat thudding in his ears as he processed the impossible truth. The man who had just tried to humiliate him, the man who looked at him like he was nothing, was the same one who once praised him as his brightest student. Richard Holloway had been his mentor. A bitter taste filled David's mouth. He had sat in the front row of Holloway's lectures, hanging on to his every word, eager to impress. He had defended cases in mock trials under his guidance. He had once believed, foolishly, that Holloway had seen something special in him, that, despite the world's prejudices, his talent and hard work had been enough. And now, Now that same man stared at him with a sneer, as if he were just another nuisance to be dismissed. But why? David watched Holloway closely. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers gripping the gavel a little too tightly. The tremor in his hands, the slight hesitation in his words, told David everything he needed to know. He remembers me, and it terrifies him. A beat of silence passed before David spoke again, his voice steady but laced with something sharper, something colder. "Forgive me, Your Honor, but I believe we've met before." The courtroom was dead silent. The words lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to ignore. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "I don't believe I have the pleasure of remembering every student who's passed through my classroom." David let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Interesting. I remember you perfectly." The energy in the courtroom shifted. Lawyers at the prosecution's table exchanged glances. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. Judge Holloway's breath was shallow, his shoulders tense. He cleared his throat and reached for the case file in front of him, as if reading the name of David's client would somehow make him forget the one standing in front of him. David took a step forward. "Let me refresh your memory. Harvard Law, class of 2003. You taught constitutional law and advanced trial advocacy." The judge's eyes darkened. David felt a sharp sting of satisfaction. "Got you. I sat in your class for 3 semesters, David continued, his voice slow and deliberate. "I was top of my class. You once told me I had the makings of a great attorney." He let the words sink in before adding, "That was before you knew what I'd become, wasn't it?" Holloway swallowed hard. David didn't blink. He refused to look away first. "Mr. Carter," Holloway finally said, regaining a sliver of composure. "This is a court of law, not a classroom reunion. We are here to discuss your client's case, not your past." David tilted his head slightly. "Oh, I agree, Your Honor, but it seems my past is what you have a problem with, not my client's case." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit, shuffled his papers awkwardly, clearly not expecting the hearing to take this turn. Judge Holloway exhaled slowly, then straightened. He reached for his gavel, likely eager to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Carter, I suggest you proceed with your case before you waste any more of this court's time." But David wasn't finished. Not yet. "I'll proceed," he said, placing his hands on the wooden podium. "But I have one question first." Holloway gave him a sharp look, but David didn't stop. "When you told me back then that I had the potential to be great, did you mean it?" A flicker of something crossed the judge's face. Regret, shame, or just anger at being confronted. For a split second, David thought Holloway might answer. But instead, the judge averted his gaze, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. That was all the confirmation David needed. He meant it. And now he hated himself for it. Because he had built his career believing that men like David Carter, black men, could only go so far. That no matter how brilliant, no matter how talented, they would always be beneath him. And yet, here David stood, no longer a student, no longer someone Holloway could mold or control. Here, David was an equal, a challenger, a man who could expose him. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as David finally shifted his focus back to his case file. "Very well, Your Honor," he said coolly. "Let's proceed." Judge Holloway's hands were still trembling when he picked up his gavel. David had won the first round, but the battle was far from over. The courtroom felt like a coiled spring, wound so tight it was on the verge of snapping. David Carter could feel the weight of every eye in the room, each person aware that something far deeper than a simple legal proceeding was unfolding. Judge Richard Holloway was gripping the gavel like it was the only thing keeping his world from crumbling. His posture was stiff, his breathing controlled, but the slight tremble in his fingers betrayed him. David wasn't just another attorney before him. He was the ghost of a truth Holloway had long tried to forget. But David wasn't here for a personal vendetta. He was here to win, and that meant shifting the focus back to his client. Clearing his throat, he turned toward the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had already exposed a lie. "Your Honor, as I was saying before we got sidetracked, my client, Marcus Hayes, is being unfairly prosecuted based on circumstantial evidence that does not hold up under scrutiny. I've submitted the necessary documentation, proving that the charges against him are not only excessive, but entirely baseless." Holloway exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Proceed with your argument, Mr. Carter." David stepped forward, opening the case file with precision. Marcus Hayes was accused of breaking into a pawn shop and stealing cash from the register. However, the surveillance footage provided by the prosecution is grainy at best and does not definitively place him at the scene. Moreover, the witness who allegedly identified Mr. Hayes originally stated that he was unsure before later changing his statement. That inconsistency alone should render this testimony unreliable. The prosecutor, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the state contends that—" David raised a hand. "If I may finish." He didn't wait for approval. What's more concerning is that this case was pushed forward despite a lack of DNA evidence, no fingerprints matching my client, and no prior criminal record. This is not a case of justice being served. This is a case of bias. Silence. Holloway's nostrils flared, and David saw his hands grip the bench tighter. "That is quite an accusation, Mr. Carter." David didn't flinch. "It's not an accusation, Your Honor. It's a fact. And if this case is not dismissed immediately, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter to the higher courts and have it reviewed for prosecutorial misconduct." The words were spoken calmly, but they struck like a hammer. David watched as the judge processed the statement. He could see the war within Holloway's mind. Dismiss the case, and it would be an admission, silent but undeniable, that this prosecution had been unjust from the start. But allow the trial to continue, and David would turn this into a national case, shining a light on the very thing Holloway had tried to suppress for years. It was checkmate. Holloway shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the wood. Then, with an exhale that carried years of suppressed resentment, he finally spoke. "This court finds that there is insufficient evidence to proceed with this trial. The case against Mr. Hayes is dismissed." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. David remained motionless, absorbing the moment. He had won. But Holloway wasn't finished. His face was tight, his pride visibly wounded. He looked at David with something bordering on fury, yet layered beneath it was something even more potent. Something he likely hadn't felt in years. Shame. Judge Holloway picked up his gavel, his voice sharp. "Court adjourned." The wooden gavel struck down like a final heartbeat, reverberating through the room. But even as the courtroom erupted into murmurs and movement, David remained still. He had dismantled a case built on injustice. But more than that, he had forced Richard Holloway to confront the truth. David didn't need to say another word. The look in the judge's eyes told him everything. Holloway knew he had lost, and for the first time in his life, he had to live with it. The courtroom slowly emptied, but David Carter remained still, watching as Judge Richard Holloway gathered his papers with stiff mechanical movements. The gavel had fallen. The case was dismissed. Justice had been served. And yet there was no satisfaction on Holloway's face. No relief. No dignity. Just the unmistakable weight of a man who had been forced to confront his own hypocrisy. David finally turned away from the bench, walking over to Marcus Hayes, his client. Marcus, a young black man in his mid-20s, was still frozen in his seat, his face a mixture of disbelief and cautious relief. "It's over," David said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Marcus blinked, his breath shaky. "That's it. I can go. David nodded. You were never supposed to be here in the first place. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes flickering toward the judge, who was still seated, as if he had lost the will to move. Man, Marcus exhaled. I thought for sure he was going to find some excuse to keep me locked up. David followed his gaze back to Holloway. So did he. The tension in the air hadn't fully dissipated, and David could feel it in every glance, every murmur, from the attorneys still lingering in the courtroom. The prosecution team avoided eye contact as they gathered their files in a hurry. Even the stenographer seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether she had just recorded history or a reckoning. David gave Marcus a firm nod. Let's get you out of here. As they moved toward the exit, a voice stopped them. Mr. Carter. David turned. Judge Holloway had finally risen from his seat, his robe still draped over his shoulders like a shield, though it no longer carried the same power. There was something unfamiliar in his expression, something David hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. David didn't move, but the room itself felt smaller, as if the years of unspoken words between them had created an invisible wall. Marcus hesitated, glancing between them. You need me to wait outside? David shook his head. Number stay. He wanted Marcus to hear whatever came next. Judge Holloway took a slow breath, his lips pressing together before he finally spoke. You were an exceptional student. David arched a brow. Funny. I don't remember you telling me that before today. Holloway's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I told myself that I was helping young men like you by making things hard for you. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight. That if you could withstand the pressure, you'd be strong enough to survive in this field. David's chest tightened. He had heard this excuse before, from professors, from colleagues, from the system itself. We're not being racist. We're preparing you for the real world. It was the same justification used to break people like him before they ever had a chance to rise. Is that what you told yourself when you looked at me today? David asked, his voice eerily calm. That you were helping? Holloway's gaze flickered. His silence was answer enough. David took a step closer, his expression unreadable. I admired you once. I thought you believed in justice. His voice was measured but sharp. But today, I saw who you really are. Holloway's face twitched, his fingers curling into fists. People like me, we were raised to see the world in a certain way. David tilted his head slightly. And people like me were raised to survive it. Silence stretched between them. The judge exhaled slowly, looking down at the bench he had presided over for years, as if seeing it for the first time. I don't expect forgiveness. David's lips pressed together. Good. Because I'm not offering it. The honesty of his words made Holloway flinch, but David didn't care. This wasn't about healing an old wound. It was about making sure the man who had spent decades controlling the fates of others finally faced himself. For the first time since the trial began, Holloway looked small. He wasn't an unshakable figure of authority anymore. He wasn't a judge sitting high on a pedestal. He was just a man. And today, he had lost. David inhaled deeply, then turned back to Marcus. Let's go. Without another word, they walked out of the courtroom, leaving Holloway standing there, alone. As David pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the air outside felt different, lighter. The sun was high now, casting golden light over the courthouse steps. Marcus let out a breath he had been holding. Man, I don't even know what to say. David gave him a small smile. You don't have to say anything. Just live your life. No system should have had the power to take it from you in the first place. Marcus nodded, his voice thick. Thank you, man, for everything. David simply patted his shoulder. As Marcus walked away, free at last, David turned back for a final glance at the courthouse behind him. For years, he had fought in rooms like this one. For years, Men like Holloway had sat behind benches, making decisions that shaped lives, believing they were untouchable. But not today. Today, the truth had won. David adjusted his suit, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. There were more battles to fight, and he was ready for them all. David Carter walked down the courthouse steps, his mind still buzzing with everything that had transpired. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air thick with the scent of summer pavement. But inside him, a storm raged. He had won today. His client was free. Justice had prevailed. And yet, there was no real satisfaction in it. Because this wasn't just about one case, one judge, one moment of exposed hypocrisy. This was about a system built to break men like Marcus Hayes before they even had a chance. A system that almost broke him. David reached the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The courthouse loomed behind him, a monument to laws that were supposed to be blind, but rarely were. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from his law partner, Camille Thompson. Saw what happened. You good? David exhaled, fingers hovering over the screen before he finally typed back, I will be. He wasn't sure if that was the truth, because part of him was still standing in that courtroom, staring at Judge Holloway, at the man who had once been his mentor, the man who had once told him he was brilliant. And yet when that brilliance had returned to his courtroom years later, when it had come wrapped in the form of a black attorney standing tall and unwavering, Holloway had recoiled. He had wanted David to succeed, but not too much, not enough to threaten his worldview. David pocketed his phone and kept walking. As he reached the parking lot, he heard footsteps behind him. Mr. Carter. He turned to see a young woman, early 20s maybe, standing a few feet away, gripping a leather-bound notebook to her chest. Her eyes were bright, nervous. I'm sorry to bother you, she said quickly. I'm a law student at Howard. I was in the courtroom today. David raised an eyebrow. Howard, huh? My alma mater. She beamed. I know, that's why I'm here. I just wanted to say thank you. David tilted his head. For what? The young woman hesitated, her grip tightening on the notebook. For proving it can be done. For not backing down. She swallowed hard. I've wanted to be a lawyer since I was a kid. But sometimes, it feels like no matter how hard we work, no matter how prepared we are, the doors will always be closed. David studied her for a long moment, because he understood exactly what she meant. How many times had he felt that same weight? The exhaustion of fighting twice as hard to be seen as equal. The frustration of knowing that some people would never respect him, no matter how perfect his case, no matter how flawless his arguments. But today, she had seen something different. Today, she had seen a door break open. David offered her a small, knowing smile. The doors will close, that's the truth. But when they do, we don't wait for them to open. She frowned slightly. Then what do we do? David's smile grew. We kick them down. The young woman let out a breathless laugh, but there was something else in her expression now. Fire. She nodded, as if absorbing the lesson. Thank you, Mr. Carter. David dipped his head. Keep pushing. The world will try to break you. Don't let it. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd outside the courthouse. David watched her go, a sense of something larger settling inside him. He thought about the mentors who had guided him, the ones who had truly believed in him, and the ones, like Holloway, who had only believed in him until he became inconvenient. And suddenly, the storm inside him began to calm. Because for every Holloway, there would be a student like her. For every racist judge who tried to tear him down, there would be someone watching, someone learning what it meant to fight back. David exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. He had work to do. There were more cases to fight, more clients who needed him, more doors that needed to be kicked down. But for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, he let himself smile. Because today he hadn't just won a case. He had set something in motion. And that was how real justice began.